On September 16th, our time on this earth with Bill Danforth came to an end. Before we start the Conversations program this evening, I want to spend a moment to remember our friend Bill, to recognize the magnitude of what he enabled through the Danforth Plant Science Center, and to remind everyone in our community that the work to realize Bill's vision is only just beginning. As we've discussed many times over the past month, Bill's life overflowed with purpose every day. Most of us here have a unique, very personal story about how that purpose changed us for the better. We join together today because of Bill's vision of what committed people could do through human ingenuity, science, to relieve hunger and improve human health, to preserve and renew the environment, and to strengthen our region. Through the program this evening, I ask that you keep in mind Bill Danforth's purpose in building the Danforth Center, and to realize that the center wasn't passed along to us with Bill's departure. It's been in our hands the whole time.
Thank you, Jim. Hello, everyone. I'm Tim Rogers, and I'm honored to be chair of the Danforth Center Friends Committee, especially as we pause to remember the stirring legacy of Bill Danforth. I met Dr. Danforth in the 36th year of my career, and I consider it to be one of those special days when fortune smiled on me with that same warm, wonderful smile that Bill had. Few, if any, matched his intellect, his integrity, and humility. All you need to know to understand Bill Danforth is what he told me when we were discussing the many ways by which the Danforth Center was a world leader. He said, "Tim, I don't want to say we're world leaders. I want to show we're world leaders." And all of us participating tonight have borne witness to the Danforth Center's inspiring mission to feed the world and heal the planet through plant science. Like you, I will always be grateful for his vision for St. Louis and for a better world. Thank you for being with us tonight, and welcome to our second virtual conversation. We're thrilled and honored to have with us tonight someone who is an expert on innovation, St. Louis native Jim McKelvey. During this event, Jim will discuss the lessons found in his new book, The Innovation Stack, and share his insight into what it truly means to be an innovator, creating tangible, meaningful change in the world. Jim McKelvey is a serial entrepreneur, inventor, philanthropist, and artist. In addition to being the co-founder of Square, the world's leading mobile payments company, Jim is also the founder of the not-for-profit Launch Code, co-founder of the Glass Art Studio and Education Center, Third Degree Glass Factory, and most recently, founder of Invisibly, a new startup aimed at helping publishers monetize content. I can't wait to learn more from his incredible story tonight. Our moderator is Dr. Natalie DiNicola, Benson Hill Chief of Staff and an Executive Committee member of the Danforth Leadership Council. Before we begin, I would like to say a few thank yous to those who made this evening possible. First of all, thank you to my colleagues on the Friends Committee and on the Conversations Committee for their tireless dedication to this program. Thank you to our longtime media sponsors of the Conversation series, St. Louis Public Radio and HEC Media. We're grateful to all of you for being here tonight, and in particular, those joining us for the first time. If you would like to learn more, and I think you will, please visit the Danforth Center website, danforthcenter.org. I encourage you to join me and countless others in advancing the Danforth mission with your contribution of financial support as well. If you have a question during tonight's conversation, click on the red arrow at the upper right side of your screen. Then use the questions tool to submit your question. Finally, in order to make our outreach programming as meaningful and motivational as possible, we depend on your feedback. You'll soon receive a brief email survey from us, and we greatly appreciate any thoughts, comments, or suggestions you have regarding tonight's event. And now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome Jim McKelvey and Dr. Natalie DiNicola to begin tonight's conversation.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Natalie DiNicola, Chief of Staff of Benson Hill, a member of the Danforth Leadership Council. Really excited to have the chance today to talk with Jim. I have his book here that Tim mentioned, The Innovation Stack. I will tell you it's great, chock full of lessons for entrepreneurs. I myself am not an entrepreneur, but I work with one. And it has definitely given a lot of insight to me about our company and some of the things we need to do. But I'd say regardless, whoever you are, it's just a really fun read with some pretty cool case studies about entrepreneurship and how it shaped some of our industries. So Jim, welcome.
Thank you, Natalie.
I want to start. Your book explains that not all new businesses are necessarily entrepreneurship, and true entrepreneurs take on a challenge that no one else has solved, and often require an integrated stack of different innovations to overcome one barrier over another as they blaze this new trail. And that this stack of innovations can actually become a really powerful differentiator to ward off competition, in your case, helping Square actually evade Amazon. So I'd like you to tell us a little bit more about what true entrepreneurship is and how your innovation stack at Square helped you to actually evade a competitor as powerful as Amazon.
Sure. So I was mystified that Square was able to beat Amazon because prior to us doing that, we could find no companies that had ever done it when they were still a startup. So when Amazon copied your product and undercuts your price, you die. And that seemed to be true 100% of the time until Square sort of survived. And after we survived, I was very happy, but also very confused because I couldn't explain why. And though I'm not really a scientist myself, I was raised by a scientist. And so it sort of burned me that I couldn't explain this phenomenon, and I wasn't just willing to write it off to luck. So I started looking for other examples. And I ended up finding just a whole series of companies that had done the same thing throughout time. I searched back hundreds of years, and this pattern seemed to emerge. And I thought, well, the pattern's sort of interesting, and I wanted to explore it further, but I couldn't describe it. And the reason I couldn't describe it is that the English language doesn't have a word for a business person who is doing something new and novel. Business in general, most of the companies you see are successful because they're replicating a formula that's been perfected long before they came into existence. So if you run an auto repair shop, okay, we would call you an entrepreneur today. But really, an auto repair shop is a fairly well-known business. And if you don't know how to run one, you can go to a trade show. You can have people come in and who are experts who've worked at other auto repair shops. There's a formula for that. And the pattern that I was seeing only applied to people who started without a formula. And we didn't have a word for it. And then I did a little research and discovered that the original meaning of the word entrepreneur was somebody who was doing business but was not copying. It was essentially a new, and typically not new in a flattering, innovative sense. New as in, this person's crazy and don't trust her because she's doing something that's never been done before, and we should protect our kids from what Dr. DiNicola is doing because it's not normal, it's not regular. But it turns out that there is a very interesting set of rules that apply only when you're doing something completely new. And there are patterns that emerge. And one of the patterns, and this is what I think allowed Square to survive Amazon, was this thing called an innovation stack. So that was the topic of the book. Or I should say that was the title of the book because it ended up being published as a business book. But really what I discuss is more what it is like to have this tool set in your hands when you're solving an unsolved problem, and what that process is like and how it's different from what we're used to doing. Because generally, I and probably everybody listening, we are all very good at copying. We are extremely good. We learn how to copy in school. We're taught to copy, literally from our very, very earliest beginnings. And we get very, very good at it. And we feel uncomfortable when there's no model to copy. And that's the point at which most people stop. And I think that's unfortunately something that we've gotten too good at. We've gotten too good at being certain about things. We've gotten too good at behavior that can be provably right. And this stops us from doing new things that could be unprovably awesome.
Wow. Well, yeah, I thought that was really, really interesting and pretty amazing that you guys accomplished that. And it was great insights going along the book on that. So a lot of the people on the call are involved in food and ag or really passionate about food and agriculture. And this industry has a really complex and disparate value chain. There are many, many steps between a company that's making inputs for a farmer, to a grain handler, to a food company, to a food retailer, and finally a consumer. In 2015, we have a slide that I think they're going to try to tee up. Are you able to tee up that slide, guys? There you go. AgFunder, that does a lot of testing in this, was tracking how much food and ag investment, how much investment's going into this sector. And it was about $900 million for a long time. And then in 2015, it about quadrupled to about $4.6 billion. And a lot of that was coming from industries that were adjacent or outside of traditional food and ag, who recognized that there was this gap between what farmers were growing and what consumers seemed to want. And a whole lot of innovators and new companies emerged that were using different kinds of technology innovations to sort of service that consumer and what they were looking for. One of the points in your book is how important it is for entrepreneurs to be very, very focused on their customer. Many times their customer is, you're bringing them something that they haven't experienced or been able to access before. And you really need to demonstrate your value to them. You need to keep your focus on them, even in the face of competition. But I'll tell you, as one of these companies that's developed some new technologies to bridge this gap between the farmer and the consumer, more of our innovation has actually had to be in our business model of how do we navigate this very complex value chain. So what advice do you have for companies that are actually working more in a B2B environment and not directly servicing the consumer that's their ultimate, I guess, customer who understands the value of what they're bringing? How do we bring along all these different pieces in the chain to help us, really blaze that trail?
Well, so self-awareness helps. So yeah, I look at that curve that graph you put up, and my question was, why the spike? Why did things trend up, and why all this? And that was investment activity, I think, was what the slide was about. And why are the investors just waking up to the potential of ag products, where for 50 years they've never really thought it as growth? And I'm reminded of something that we discovered when we were starting LaunchCode. Because LaunchCode, for those of you who don't know, is a program that trains people to become programmers and then places those programmers out in 300 companies in St. Louis, and there's probably 1,000 other companies around the country that we place these people at. And the question is, well, who needs programmers? And the answer is everybody needs programmers today, because most businesses, I don't care if you're ag tech or banking or a glass studio on Del Mar, like, you're a tech company to some extent, and the ability to control your fate by having in-house programming talent is super important. So I would call up. I remember calling Andy Taylor at Enterprise when we were just starting LaunchCode, and Andy had dozens of open jobs for programmers, and they're a rental car company. Well, what do they have to do with this? So it turns out that I think one of the things that's explaining that graph is that ag tech has now been recognized as tech. And when it is tech, the investments, which is a very, very powerful thesis for tech investors, starts to attract attention. So I think that's what explains the graph. But the other part of your question was, how do we sort of make sense of this if you're a B2B company and yet have to keep a focus on a consumer and things like that? And what I would say is that so in my research, I didn't find that the focus of the company was that important. In other words, if the company was business to business, innovation in that space is just as important if it's business to consumer. Now, I used some business to consumer examples because they were easier for consumers to understand. But the basic process is the same, which is that if you, for some reason, find yourself in a company where you are unable to copy what has been done before, then in fact you are forced down this weird path that you're not used to, which is called innovation. And the sort of the most interesting discovery there is that most of the people who are considered great innovators did not intend to be innovators. They were just trying to do something and ended up being forced to innovate. And one of the classic examples I use in the book was not Herb Kelleher, but Ingvar Kamprad, the founder of IKEA, literally kicked out of his country, basically driven out of Sweden for a bunch of reasons, and ended up being forced to create all this innovation in, what it was post-World War II Europe. And he didn't want to do that. He didn't want to leave Sweden, but they kicked him out, so he was forced to do so. And actually, a lot of the IKEA innovations are not things that a consumer would ever see. They're things that were, relevant business to business. So I don't think innovation is really tied to, a customer focus or a business focus so much as it tied to a specific need. And unfortunately, at least through my research, it turns out that need is usually not one that you can directly seek. What I mean by that is you can't sit there and wake up one day and say, well, I just saw, a great talk at the Danforth Center. I'm going to go out and be innovative on, this weekend. More likely what will happen is you will at some point find yourself in this very awkward position where what you need to do can't be done with current tech. With whatever mankind has figured out, the problem you have is on this side of the line. It's living over here, and mankind has figured out everything over here, but now you run up against the limit of what we can do, and now you're forced, if you want to go past what we've done traditionally, to become innovative. And it's a brutal, horrible process. It's typically unpleasant, but unpleasant stuff makes for good humor. So, it's fun to talk about in hindsight, but generally the process is pretty excruciating. But I don't find that, B2B is any different than B2C, at least for the stuff that I've studied.
Yeah, I will say that it was a little bit humbling to see what some of those case studies, what people like, the resilience of what they went through, and I'm sure you experienced some of that too. It was pretty humbling. So another important message in your book was about timing, the importance of timing, and the importance of external events that can really impact your innovation stack. In your case, mobile tech and the iPad, there's things that are happening outside that can have a really big impact on you being in the right place at the right time and being able to overcome all the barriers you need to. Well, COVID is in no doubt a big external event. And when you look at food, it's really highlighted a lot of strengths and vulnerabilities in our food system. So we have, consumers now paying more attention than ever, I think, to how their food was grown and even the safety of it. Way more online shopping than we saw before. People experiencing that they couldn't access certain products that they usually want to and are trying some new products that they might not have tried before. And then I think also some increased sensitivity among some consumers of, really appreciating the connection between food and health, because unfortunately, a lot of these non-communicable diseases like heart disease and diabetes and things like that are complications when it comes to a COVID, infection. So it's a kind of a wake-up call. You're seeing a lot more voices and articles about sort of a wake-up call we need in our food system. And I was curious, what do you think entrepreneurs in this space, how should they be looking at the shifts underway, and how should they be responding to this kind of a global challenge?
So, yes, I did put a chapter in my book on timing. But then keep in mind, I chose to release this book that I'd worked on for 3 solid years on March 10th, which, if you look at the history of publishing, there was probably not a worse day in the last century to release a new title. I picked that day with a room full of experts, and I thought, oh, March 10th, let's do that. So, take everything I say on the topic of timing, with a large grain of salt. But yes, look, timing matters, especially if you're doing something that's entrepreneurial, i.e., that has not been solved by humans before, because you're constantly being given a new set of tools. And so one of the things that I think about often is how many products are perfect but early. And the example I always use to people who want to get the idea is I ask them to name the first social network, and nobody gets this right. But if anyone is old enough and geeky enough to remember GeoCities, GeoCities had GeoChat, which, if you wanted to, could be your own little, what would now be a Facebook page, but there was a social network where you would connect other people, and GeoCities was followed by half a dozen other things. Probably the most successful was Friendster, then came MySpace, then came Facebook. And so being first, being early is not necessarily right. So coming up with the right idea at the wrong time, even if that time is too early, still doesn't work. So your question was very interesting, because your question was about entrepreneurs and how they should view the current upheaval that we're going into. And I'm going to assume that you're using the archaic definition of entrepreneur. I'm assuming that you're meaning people who have created something that's new, as opposed to something that's copied. If you have just copied something, if you are running a business that has for centuries or decades been successful, a business model that is proven, there's a very high likelihood that COVID has disrupted that business model. So my glass studio, Third Degree Glass Factory out on Delmar, we've basically been shut, and we're effectively in an event venue. I mean, we run a glass studio, we have art, shows and galleries and all this stuff, but we actually make money from our bar. If we're not selling alcohol, we are not paying any of the staff. So the glass studio operates as this sort of loss leader, and then we sell beer, and we haven't sold any beer since March. The place is in this tremendous upheaval because it was a traditional business. It was an event venue, and we got shut down. But let's talk about the entrepreneurs, because I think that was your question. And an entrepreneur, and again, we're using the definition of somebody doing something new, they run into some very specific problems. And one of them that I've personally encountered more often than I'd like to think is the inability of an entrepreneur to get a new idea noticed. And we noticed this even in the very early days of Square. So when we started building our first Square readers, which I happen to have one here, these little guys. The reason I made this, so I was the guy that basically designed this thing, and I was the one who was responsible for making it this frustratingly small. And I say frustrating because if you try to swipe a credit card through this, the thing wobbles half the time, or technically it wobbles 79% of the time. So 21% of the reads are dead. From the get-go, you just can't get them because the card is wobbling. And it takes a little practice to learn how to move a card through this in a stable way. And the easy solution to that is just make it a little wider. And I did that when I first built these things. I made a wide version, I made a small version, and I test them out on people. And the wide version was boring, because people have seen credit cards read by wide readers for their whole life. I mean, that's all you've ever seen. But when I came out with something that was physically too small to perform the task well, it was interesting. And that was so important, because I traded, and knowingly so, traded usability, which any engineer would value, for noticeability. So how does this relate to your question? Well, it turns out getting something new noticed is very tough. I did it in 2010 with a trick. Made something that was impossibly small. Somebody ran your credit card for the first time on something like this. You go, what the hell just happened? And we got a little bit of attention. Okay, so we're now living in this pandemic. Normal businesses are disrupted. Normal life is disrupted. And yet that is some good news to entrepreneurs, because it turns out that humans, when things are going well, ignore most of what they do. They don't do it consciously. There's so many things I do during a day that I don't ever think about until for some reason they stop working. So if I get up in the morning and none of the lights work, or the house is 20 degrees, then I notice that we have lights or a heating system. But up until then, I wouldn't notice. I've got a heating system in this place, and I haven't thought about it in a month. So entrepreneurs in a time of crisis have the ability to get their ideas noticed because people become more receptive. So my message to the entrepreneurs in the food world or the plant world are to take advantage of this moment and maybe try to get that message that you've been screaming and nobody's been listening to. Try it again, because unfortunately people are suffering right now, but fortunately when people suffer they become more open-minded.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I do think that makes sense. I mean, I think there is, to your point, we all in this country, many of us can kind of take advantage or take for granted our food system, and for a minute we didn't get, it was harder than it normally is for some of us. And I think that that gives us the chance, to recognize people are paying attention to this and those serving them. So yeah, I think it's an interesting dynamic. Well, I want to switch gears just a little bit to one of your other passions. So you're a true champion for St. Louis, and in particular for the role innovation plays in our community and our economic development. And that is one of the pillars for the Danforth Center. And I think we would all say that Dr. Danforth was really a pioneer in laying a foundation that many of us are standing on. And in particular, the Danforth Plant Science Center has the largest concentration of plant scientists. We're here in the heartland, we're food and agriculture, the breadbasket for our country. So in a lot of ways, St. Louis is really starting to shape up as sort of a hub for innovation, in particular in food and agriculture, which I think and many people think is really pretty exciting. I'm curious, in your mind, you've done so much work in attracting talent here and really helping to spur innovation here. What are your thoughts on sort of the state of innovation in our community, the kind of talent we're attracting, and in particular, what role do you think, if any, the sort of national racial tensions and inequities and that attention that we've seen nationally, what kind of impact might that be having on our region?
Well, Bill Danforth, who was somebody that I sort of grew up almost worshiping, because he and my father worked together their entire career. He was always the chancellor. He was the chancellor when I went to Washington University. I always, literally looked up to Dr. Danforth. But he was very smart. And one of the things that I think he did in founding the Danforth Plant Science Center was he bet on a strength that would be hard for other cities to replicate. So we already had, the world headquarters for Monsanto. We already had a large concentration of life science, particularly plant science knowledge. We had, world-class institution at Washington University, and a lot of other resources that, collectively would give us sort of this head start. And then, you double down on that with an institution like the Plant Science Center, and all of a sudden you do create, this sort of worldwide hotspot for excellence. And I think that, I wish there were 50 examples of something like the Danforth Plant Science Center around town. Unfortunately, there aren't. There are a couple, but we are, I think, lagging behind in total innovation to a lot of other cities. And I've thought a lot about racial inequality and segregation. And as a matter of fact, those of you who don't know this, the idea for starting Launch Code actually happened because of the Seeds of Change keynote that I gave at the Plant Science Center. So nobody remembers that speech because somebody passed out in the middle of it, and the cameraman who was supposed to get it was helping the person who passed out. It was a pretty bad, well, I don't know if it was a bad speech. It was probably the most inflammatory speech I ever gave, because I called out a bunch of my fellow St. Louisans for being, 5th in the country at segregation. Like, we're top 10 in very few lists, but we're top 10 in segregation. And I called that out at the beginning of the speech, and I said, here are things we could do to possibly solve it. And one of those ideas was Launch Code. I basically mapped the whole thing out. People got excited about it, and there was this sort of popular uprising of people who wanted to try to implement this thing that it had been nothing but theory. And eventually it worked. We tried it and it worked. And surprisingly, Launch Code was a new idea. It was something that no other city had tried. And the way we do Launch Code gives us a huge advantage in St. Louis as far as tech talent. But the core message that I surfaced at that speech, I think would probably be appropriate to surface now, which is, we're not the only city that has a problem with racism and segregation. We're not only the only city that has a problem with an underclass that is almost prevented from accessing any of the great stuff that we have available. We have 100,000 people living below the poverty line north of Del Mar, which is the street where I concentrate most of my efforts. But it's that racial and socioeconomic dividing line. And again, thinking as an entrepreneur, which means that what I'm about to say has never worked and might not work and hasn't been done. But if it does work, it will have an outside change. So the way I would look at it would be to say, how can we turn our excellence in segregation, and I don't mean excellence in the term that it's a vile way to say it, but I say it that way because it's one of the things we actually happen to be good at. Do we have a way to flip that, to take all of the negativity there and somehow harness it for positive ways? I don't know. It turns out it's one of the things we shouldn't be good at. We are good at. We're good at segregating. We've got this we have a bigger problem than most cities our size because we've been so good at segregating for so long. And does this offer us any opportunity to be better? And I think the answer is, in some weird way, yes, because I think if we could be in the vanguard of addressing that problem through very novel ways, that could literally catalyze a rebirth of our town that would blow away anything they're doing in Nashville. It would, I mean, the people of my father's generation were wringing their hands about Chicago. Oh, we could have been Chicago. Well, now we're looking down at Nashville going, Nashville, really? But Nashville's kicking ass. I think St. Louis could even do better than that. But what we have to do is come up with some new things to address a problem that unfortunately we excel at, which is to run a city where a significant portion of the population doesn't have access to things that we all take for granted.
Yeah. Well, thank you for all the work that you're doing to try to address some of that, and really innovative ways of doing it. So we're going to turn it to the audience Q&A now. Just a reminder to folks, click on the red arrow at the upper right side of your screen, and there's a question tool there if you want to submit a question. So here's the first question. When evaluating startups, what do you prioritize as key components for success? For example, is it the management team, the market opportunity, their IP, etc.?
The first thing I look for is to figure out if it's a business venture or an entrepreneurial venture. Entrepreneurial ventures are way more risky, but they have a disproportionately high payoff rate. Businesses are easier to invest in because they're formulaic, and you can basically say, oh, well, these people are experts because they did it before, and they're probably going to do it again, and the team worked together, and they're, it's a much safer bet. For instance, I'm a general partner in a financial technology venture capital fund, okay? And I will tell you right there, we're not trying to be innovative, not at all. Like, we don't invest in innovative companies. We invest in formulaic companies that historically return 10 to 1. And that's all we want. We just want 10 to 1. I mean, Square paid off, I don't know what, 1,000 to 1 plus something, 5,000 to 1 now, I guess. We're not looking for that sort of return. We're looking for 10 to 1. 10 to 1. 10 to 1 makes us happy all day long. So when I'm looking at a startup, if I'm a venture capitalist, if I'm investing other people's money and my own money to make a predictably safe return, then I'm looking for a formula. We've got a formula. We run the formula. The formula makes money, but it's boring. Entrepreneurship is more interesting. So there's a firm that I invested in, Immunophotonics. And Immunophotonics, St. Louis company, although not a St. Louis technology. The technology was developed by somebody else, but the two entrepreneurs were here in St. Louis, and they came up with this, sort of novel form of treating cancer. And they didn't know why it worked. And so they were running out of money. They had this Peruvian test case where they'd taken a bunch of people with, stage 4 metastatic breast cancer, and had given them this drug, and a shockingly high number of people in this study had recovered, like including in some cases complete remission of the cancer. And you look at this and go, this is life-changing, this is amazing. And yet they couldn't get any money. And it turns out all the smart life scientists who understood T cells and B cells and how cancer works, and I'm not in that group, refused to make any investment in this. So my wife and I sat down with the two entrepreneurs, and we said, either these people are lying to us blatantly, or there's something here that at least deserves a chance. And we said, okay, let's say 80% chance they're lying to us, or there's something wrong and that we're just too ignorant to figure it out. Even if that's an 80% chance, the 1 in 5 shot that there might be something here is worth giving us the money to keep them in business. So we made the first investment in the company. Now, that was a stupid investment. Okay, so that was me as an investor basically being a known idiot, doing something that doesn't make any sense financially. I would never do that with somebody else's money, but I do it with my own because what the hell. And it turns out, surprise, that here we are 5 years later, and they've kind of figured out how it's working, and they're doing a big study in Switzerland to find out if this cancer treatment, which has now attracted the attention of some really top scientists, is going to be a potential serious, I've even heard the term cure for certain types of cancer. They think that the pathway that they've unearthed could do something literally life-changing, life-saving. So that's an entrepreneurial investment. But again, you're going to make those, and most of the time you're going to be wrong. And you have to be willing to do stuff that is likely to blow up in your face if you want to be investing at that level. I would encourage more St. Louisans to do it who have money to lose. There are plenty of people, I know there are plenty of people listening to this, seminar tonight, who can afford to burn enough money to get a radical idea into the world. And I would encourage a few people to do that, because look, if it doesn't work, you're not going to be hurt that much. But if it does work, you have the potential for massively magnifying the impact that you have on the world. And like, if this cancer treatment actually turns out to be effective, how many thousands or millions of lives could that save? And to think that, you know, we were a small part of keeping that going is really gratifying. So I look at it both ways.
That's a pretty inspirational way to end this thing. So our time went really fast. I want to thank you for sharing some really cool stories and insights with us. Again, I really recommend people to check out the book. It's a great read. It's fun. And I want to thank the Danforth Center and all of our audience for joining us. Have a good evening, everybody.
Thanks, Natalie. Bye-bye.